the talk is kind of longish and also dense, which wasn't avoidable. I was thinking about it back and forth, but I need several elements to make my point. So it's quite long, I have to say. But probably since it's online, you can meanwhile, relax here and there if you don't need this part for yourself. So I hope you will not drop off the line. So thank you very much for having me, and I will start. Okay, now, yeah, so the leading questions of my talk are the following. So basically, it's one question: what is apperception in Kant? Meaning, what kind of entity is it? And more precisely, under which category does it fall? And here are my theses. I will claim first that apperception is a causal power of the mind. And second, because we cannot know whether it is ultimately irreducible, Kant takes it to be what he calls a Vermögen, and which is in English mostly translated as faculty, but for some reasons that I probably should change because the English native speakers might struggle here. But because of the Latin background, I say capacity for Vermögen, and this will be relevant at some point. Okay, so Kant takes it to be a Vermögen, a capacity, which is a supervenient causal cognitive power. And third, Kant holds powerful capacitism, which is powers metaphysics of the mind, which is my third claim. The fourth thesis says that Kant has a nuanced background theory of the metaphysics of the human mind, according to which it is a complex of interacting powerful capacities. So what are my reasons to hold these maybe strong claims? Maybe it sounds really strong to you. I don't know. I'm used to it now. Okay, my reasons are the following. Kant calls apperception repeatedly a capacity, a Vermögen. Apperception fulfills the identity criteria for capacities that Kant actually uses, and I will introduce them later. The term was shaped by Crusius to denote a specific kind of causal power, and I believe that Kant simply adopts more or less Crusius' theory of the cognitive capacities, a specific form, a specific model of the cognitive capacities. Fourth, Kant holds a powers metaphysics with respect to matter in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, and that seems to be in the background of his model of the human mind, as he also says in different passages. Also, it is common at the time to draw an analogy between physical powers and cognitive powers, namely capacities, and I think Kant does so too. The structure of apperception, as well as the other capacities he assumes, maps perfectly with the structure of powers in a powers metaphysics. And that's what I will be trying to show. Up to now, I think Kant's use of the capacity theory framework of his contemporaries has more or less been ignored or assessed negatively, or as I think, assessed in a kind of somewhat not really informed way by powers metaphysics. So there are some exceptions, and here are some names: Hesbring-Walter, Wunderlich, Falduto, Haag, Heinz, Heidemann, Land, Schaffer. But still it's underdeveloped, and I believe also that a really full account of causal powers differs also from these accounts on what Kant's capacities metaphysics is really like. So my general claim is the instantiation of certain capacities and the facts about them are highly relevant in Kant's transcendental philosophy, not least for freedom and morality, but also for modality and truth and many other aspects of his philosophy, namely also laws of nature and many more. So this is the structure I want to present you with. First, I have to say something about the powers metaphysics from a contemporary standpoint, to introduce the conceptual framework, the metaphysical framework, the metaphysical models that seem to me to be really helpful in understanding what is going on in these capacities theories of the 18th century. Then I want to say something about the models of cognitive capacities in Wolff and Crusius, because that's necessary to understand what is going on in Kant, why he seems to just make use of all of these models without really saying much about them. And third, I apply all of this to Kant's concept of powers, capacities, and faculties, show what Kant says about these terms and what his model seems to be, before I then in part 4 apply this to his term of the transcendental apperception. Okay, and then there's a very short resume. Okay, since I have so many slides, I go further to the first part of my talk, the powers metaphysics. And so the powers metaphysics says that powers are properties that are a specific kind of dispositions. Like dispositions, powers are properties that an entity can instantiate without manifesting it. And also, a power is a property which manifests itself under certain conditions. So under certain conditions, it manifests. Under other condition, it probably doesn't. Some dispositional properties may always be manifesting, and this is because their manifestation conditions always obtain, or maybe they probably don't even need manifestation conditions. That's a point of discussion in this debate. Okay, so but powers are also properties that are such that their manifestation can be disturbed if other powers counteract, even if the manifestation conditions obtain. So they might not manifest if there are counteracting forces, powers that stop it from manifesting. And this is relevant for the cognitive capacities later. Also, these properties have a modal profile, as people say, and this shows itself in being directed towards their manifestations. So power is, if it is instantiated, it makes the substance, in Kant's terms, sit there quasi and wait until the manifestations conditions or some conditions obtain, and then it manifests. So it really kind of, it pushes towards its manifestation. Also, it's productive, and that makes it a causal power, this disposition, a causal power. It produces the manifestation or a certain effect. So that's its causal profile. So power is also properties whose manifestations are invariant, and that's also really important. So power always gives rise to the very same behavior or the very same act. And that gives it its nomological profile. So there can be laws describing the behavior that the power gives rise to under certain conditions. And that's due to the invariance of its manifestation. Also, these properties have a fundamental dispositional modality that grounds all other forms of modality, like being directed at the necessitation of its manifestation. And that's why these properties are able or are fit to ground laws of nature, for instance, and explain the necessity that laws of nature are connected with. Also, these powers are epistemically accessible according to powers or dispositionalists, accessible through their manifestations. So in, epistemically accessing the behavior that the powers give rise to, we can epistemically access the powers themselves, indirectly though, the identity of which has to be fixed by their manifestations. So this is also a very important point in the discussion in the 18th century, is the point, how do we fix which powers there are in nature, or which powers there are in our human mind? How many? And what are the criteria? So what are the identity criteria that make it possible to fix their identity? Now, there are different models of the structure of dispositions or powers, and here's the so-called one of the simplest models, the so-called DSM model, which says there is a disposition plus its so-called stimulus conditions or trigger conditions, and that leads causally, and that's the error, it's a causal error, leads to its manifestation. So there is a disposition and there is a stimulus, and this stimulus then together with the disposition gives rise to the manifestation. Here, the identity of the disposition is the directedness towards its manifestation, given S. Right? So the identity then is fixed by its manifestation plus the stimulus conditions. Okay, there are more complex models. The so-called interaction model by Martin that says that most dispositions actually need manifestation partners to get manifested. So if you think of the stimulus conditions that have to obtain such that the disposition manifests, you can think of the stimulus as being another power or another disposition. So there have to be at least two dispositions to give rise to the manifestation, right? So there are two dispositions, they come together and give rise to one causal effect to its manifestation. Okay, so this interaction model is very important for what we are heading at. Now, powers can or must interact in order to bring about a resultant behavior. And you can think of these parallelogram of forces from physics. And interestingly, later on, I will show you that Kant brings that in also in a very nice quote. So there are two forces here, physical forces, mechanical forces, and they interact. And the resultant behavior is this one, the red arrow here, to bring about a common action, right? So two forces, one action, that is because they interact. So here is an example of two power instantiations of the same kind, but the same holds for powers of different kinds. So here is magnetism and gravitation, and that gives rise to this metal here, kind of what's that? It it sits. It doesn't fall to the ground, but it kind of flies in the air. So there is a counteract. So gravitation pulls it down, and magnetism pulls it up. And the resultant behavior is that it kind of sits there in the air, doesn't move, and that's interesting for our cognitive capacities case later, because we will see that the mind is in interaction of different kinds of powers. So, okay. Now, what's also important, the distinction between single track and multi-track models. one disposition or power can give rise to different kinds of manifestation given different manifestation conditions obtain. And this is the so-called multi-track model. So, given manifestation conditions one obtain, a causal power manifests in a certain way, given certain manifestation conditions two, say, then it gives rise to manifestation two, and given still other manifestation conditions, it might give rise to still other another manifestation. Okay, to give some further complexity here, I'm sorry, but we need that, is to say that dispositions don't manifest in a behavior, but they manifest in influences. And these influences are the entities that interact and give rise to resultant behaviors. So this model tackles the problem that if we have a multi-track model here, the identity conditions for singling out a disposition or a power might get us into trouble. Because if we have various manifestation conditions, it seems that we don't have reason to believe that there's one power, but that we have reason to believe that there are different powers. So thinking of the manifestation of powers as being influences that together give rise to a behavior lets us have all the benefits of a multi-track model without kind of giving us problems with the identity criteria. And don't worry, this is relevant for the 18th century theories of cognitive capacities. You will see that later. Okay, now, powerful capacitism now is a theory that claims, and it's a theory that I hope will be a interesting theory at one day. It claims that the human mind is an organized system of cognitive capacities, which are powers, which are causal powers. Now, what are capacities? They are powers that manifest themselves in cognitive acts whose effects are cognitive products, such as ideas in general, ideas of concrete things, such as cats, houses, tables, or abstract things such as concepts, judgments, conclusions, theories, etc. Right? So that's what is specific about cognitive causal powers, is that they produce these entities. They produce representational entities. They produce representations, ideas, judgments in Kant's terms, conclusions, theories, etc. So that's really a wonderful thing that they can do. Nothing else can do this. So it's really a unique power that we have. They are powers analogous to physical powers. That is, they resemble physical powers in a number of features. Like physical powers, they are dispositional in nature. They share the same properties that are named above, but they differ from physical powers in various ways, and I will come to this later. Now, as you can surely see so far, powerful capacitism is a metaphysical account of the human mind. There is another form of capacitism on the market, which is currently under debate. And authors here are Kelp, Schellenberg, and Nita. And I call them epistemic capacitists because most of them, they kind of vary a bit about. So they talk a lot about functions. Sometimes they use the term powers, but it's not really clear whether they have really a powers metaphysics in the background to flesh out what capacities really are. So more or less, it seems a functional theory in my in my view. Okay, now take this framework and apply this to the models of cognitive capacities that were under debate in the 18th century, before Kant, namely and most prominently in Christian Wolff and Christian August Crusius. Now, first, why? So, what is the background of these authors in thinking of cognition and our cognitive access to the world in terms of causal powers or capacities or the like? Now, in the early modern period, there were in the sciences had been so hugely successful by giving reductive accounts of phenomena. And Newton's contribution to the scientific explanation can be seen as follows. Newton gave a unified explanation for different phenomena in very different domains, like planetary motion on the one hand and free fall on Earth. And he gave these a unified explanation as saying that these are manifestations of a simple fundamental force, namely gravitational force, right? So Newton claimed that there is such a thing as a gravitational force that gives rise to these different phenomena in nature. He did so by common cause abduction, but that's just by side. So Kepler's laws and Galileo's laws can be derived from the law of gravitation because both of them describe the very same force, gravitation, under different manifestation conditions, right? So now transfer this explanatory model to the cognitive domain. And then you can ask a question like the following: what are the fundamental powers that produce phenomena of cognition, and which laws describe the way they act? Now we look at Christian Wolff. Christian Wolff's theory was that cognitive powers basically, there is only one cognitive powers. There's only one cognitive power, and this is what he calls the vis representativa, the power to represent. So, and that's kind of really simple, if every cognitive product is a way of representing things, you might postulate, okay, if that's the case, we have one power, and that's the power of, for representation, a power that produces representations. And then you can say very many things given the models we have so far. Now, what are Wolff's arguments for thinking that there's only one power? He gives several arguments. The most important one comes from the simplicity of the substance, which you can find in the Psychologia Rationalis. So he says, if there is a substance which is undivisible, it can only have one power. And since the soul is a simple substance, it can only have one power. Otherwise, it would be there could be distinguished several substances, and that's not that's not compatible with the simplicity of the substance. So now Wolff distinguishes between the one power of the human mind and its faculties. And he does so given a multi-track model. So he introduces a multi-track model of powers and says, and I will show you a model very soon, but what he says about powers is the following: power is vis, and he says powers are causally effective, they bring about change, they are kind of really the ontological, hardcore, the hardware, the ontological hardware, so to speak. They are fundamental, ontologically fundamental, and they're really existing properties of a substance. This is not the case with faculties. They're not causally efficacious. They are mere metaphysical. They just describe metaphysical possibilities of the occurrence of a change, and they are ontological derivative, and they're just kind of conceptual entities. They are not really ontological fundamental entities. So, and this is how you can think about this model. There's one, so the blue things are the things that really are there. The black ones is just kind of abstract entities. They, yeah, probably are produced by our minds, by abstraction. So the blue ones, the vis representativa, this is the power. Given several manifestation conditions, it gives rise to different representations, and we can group them together in representation types and just kind of push and say, this is a faculty, this is a Vermögen in Wolff's term. So this is a faculty, facultas, as Wolff says, right? So there are different facultates, but just one power. Okay. Now, this model has been criticized by Christian August Crusius, who says, that what he asks, so what are the identity criteria? So how can we say that, the multi-track model is really, is that really good model? I mean, isn't it the case that we should identify powers according to their actions? So if there's a certain specific kind of action that we have access to epistemically, shouldn't we then say or assume that there's a power that gives rise to this action? And then, if we find that our human mind is able to perform several different actions, shouldn't we think of the human mind as a complex of different powers? So that's his model now. So he thinks the understanding, what he calls it, is a complex of different powers. And they bring about different action types and different representation types. So sensible representations, judgments, inferences, theories, whatever, they are performed, they are given rise to by different powers of the human mind. Now, for Kant, it is highly informative to know that Crusius has another structure, differentiation with respect to powers. So he differentiates between fundamental powers of the mind, which are simple, and they don't need boundary conditions to act. But, and that's his skepticism, they cannot be discovered by us. So we don't have epistemic access to them. But he assumes, there must be fundamental powers. Otherwise, we can't explain how, causation, why there is causation at all. Now, that's not so horrible because there are also derivative powers of the mind. They are composite and they are based on the interaction of the fundamental powers. They can be discovered, so we have epistemic access to these derivative powers. So I think that Crusius can best be understood to take a modern term of thinking that there are fundamental powers and then there are supervening powers, supervening on the fundamental powers, and they supervene in that sense that we can still say that the derivative powers are powers. They might not be powers on top of the fundamental powers, numerically different, but it's absolutely fine to say that in a derivative sense, these powers give rise causally to a certain behavior. Now, and that's interesting for Kant, he still has another term, namely principal powers of the human mind. And they are the least composite that are accessible to us. So there is a level of this supervenience leveled model of the human mind. There is kind of a relatively fundamental level that we have epistemic access to, that is explanatorily interesting and important for us to explain our cognitive behavior, our phenomena of the human mind. And Crusius believes there are four principal powers of the human mind: the power of sensation, memory, the power of judgment, and the power of invention. Okay, so this is the model. Now, if you put that in a nice drawing, as I try to do this, you have this leveled picture of the human mind. This kind of pink flat area wants to show, the level up to which our epistemic axis reaches. So these would be this is the level to which we have epistemic access, and there may be a level below that to which we don't have epistemic access. Okay. And the real causing is done by this fundamental level, but in a derivative sense, in this blue sense, there's still, causal efficacy. We can say, since there is, since there is this causation going on the fundamental level, since they supervene on this, we can, in a derivative sense, say that these capacities kind of bring about these mental acts that give rise to cognitive products. Okay, so that's Crusius' multi-layered model of cognitive capacities and complex influences. And now, since Kant, and that's what I take, adopts this model, but Kant concludes, because principal powers are derivative, and since they are interacting powers, capacities are distinct from faculties in the Wolffian sense, right? So we can take this model and introduce the faculties talk to have some more richer structure to talk about the human mind. But we have to know, where we are in this really complex model. And just to name a few things, a few of these, right? Just to name a few, I think that apperception, for instance, is for Kant a principal power of the human mind. It's a relatively fundamental power, namely such a power that we have epistemic access to because of the identity criteria we should introduce. But it is possible that it is, metaphysically speaking, supervenient on other more fundamental powers. And I give you another example of a faculty, probably like the higher faculty of desire. The higher faculty of desire, for instance, is a very complex entity. It not only includes capacities, but it also includes products of capacities, such as principles or other non-causal powers entities. So it's not even a derivative power, it's just a faculty, it's an abstract notion for a very complex entity. And there are very many more in Kant of these faculties, very complex things. Now, okay, so Kant actually adopts this and introduces faculties on top to have a richer structure. But that's not very important for our topic today. It's just a side note. Okay. Now, so powers, capacities, and faculties in Kant. Also in Kant, powers are properties of a substance, of being a specific cause. So it's, as you know, a derivative category. It's the causality of a substance. Now, what are cognitive powers? They seem to be fundamental powers manifesting in cognitive acts that I have to, produce cognitive outputs. So they are real, simple properties so they really bring about something causally. Now he talks about also the term cognitive capacity. So cognitive capacity is a derivative power supervening on interacting cognitive powers. These are real complex properties. That's what he takes from Crusius. And he still distinguishes from these faculties, Fähigkeiten, which are abstract terms for complex mental performance, whose identity can be determined functionally or pragmatically or according to other aspects. So they are not supervenient. They are really very highly complex things, not only consisting of causal powers on the lower level, but on other things, other entities of different categories. Okay. So capacity theories of the 17th and 18th centuries, according to them, cognitive acts and their products are conceptualized according to the model of physical powers, but cognitive powers differ from physical powers in the laws that describe their mode of action. Physical forces are described by mechanical or dynamical laws. I mean, the behavior they give rise to. But what are the laws that the cognitive capacities act according to which they act, or the behavior that describe the behavior of the cognitive capacities manifestations? What are these laws? And a very traditional idea here is that the laws of thought are the laws of logic. And here is the first page of the Logic of Port-Royal, where you can see that la logique ou l'art pensée. So it's, the logic is the art of thinking. Now I come to Kant and apply all of that to Kant's concept of cognitive capacities. Here's a very long quote I really like from the Yeshe logic. And you might be skeptical about the logic lectures. I share your skepticism a bit, but this quote is so constantly in all of his logic lectures. All these lectures start in the very same way. And this is a quote I really at least want to start reading out to you. And it says that in the following, and I have to quote that in German, I'm afraid, because I don't have the translation. So I will quote it in German. Alle Regeln, nach denen der Verstand verfährt, sind entweder notwendig oder zufällig. Die ersteren sind solche, ohne welche gar kein Gebrauch des Verstandes möglich wären. Die letzteren solche, ohne welche ein gewisser bestimmter Verstandesgebrauch nicht stattfinden würde. Die zufälligen Regeln, welche von einem bestimmten Objekt der Erkenntnis abhängen, sind so vielfältig als diese Objekte selbst. So gibt es zum Beispiel einen Verstandesgebrauch in der Mathematik, der Metaphysik, Moral und so weiter. And then he goes on to say about these necessary laws, the contingent laws of thought, and so on. And that's the introduction to the logic. So basically, Kant subscribes to this traditional view of logic as telling us what the laws of cognition are. Now, also in the logic lectures, very interestingly, Kant distinguishes, as I said, the laws of logic as laws of facts that are manifestations of the capacity's behavior. So the law of facts that describe the capacity's manifestation. And they describe the manifestation of the capacities if they act under certain ideal conditions. Okay, so the laws of logic describe how our thought acts if not interfered with other powers, such that their manifestation kind of is irritated and gives rise to that interferes with it, and such that that behavior is non-ideal. And then he goes on to say that there are laws of logic that are law statements. They are manifestations of the understanding's power to generate law statements. And these are, in the contemporary law debate, the universal generalizations, and Kant calls them artificial laws or rules. So there are facts about the human mind. This is the invariant behavior given ideal conditions of their manifestations, and the law statements, the artificial laws, as Kant says. And third, there are precepts for the acquisition of science. These are also laws of logic. They belong to the artificial laws, and probably they're something like the rules of inquiry or something like this. Okay. Yeah, so power in Kant is, like Kant says in the logic lectures, the determining ground for the reality of an action. It produces the action, and it is alone sufficient for the occurrence of an action. This is important. It's alone sufficient. So a real power probably doesn't need a manifestation partner. Now, capacities differ from that. They are not alone sufficient for the action to occur. They need a manifestation partner, right? Think of gravitation. Gravitation is an example in the Kantian sense of a power. It doesn't need, in the Kantian sense, a manifestation partner. It's just there, it acts whenever, it's instantiated. But this is not the case with capacities. They need manifestation partners to manifest. Capacities are also powers that are triggered by something else. So several capacities can jointly bring about an action under suitable conditions. And Kant call them also an inner principle of the possibility of an action. So if something instantiates a certain capacity, it's possible of it to behave like, like that and such, because it has this capacity, but it needs another capacity to give rise to the behavior. And Fähigkeit in Kant is, according to the Wolffian scheme, an abstract notion for these, as I said, complexes out of different elements of different categories, not only powers, but abstract entities like, principles or whatever you have, concepts, emotions, sensations, and everything else. Okay, so that's basically, if you apply a model of powers, a powers model on these theories of the 18th century, that is according to my reading what you get. Now and then passages like these from the beginning of the analytic of concepts that make you understand probably a bit different why Kant thinks that transcendental philosophy is an analysis of cognitive capacities. And this is really interesting. Transcendental philosophy differs from empirical investigations of the human mind because, and that's Kant's claim, because he thinks that given that the laws of thought are the laws of logic, and if you individuate the capacities according to the laws of logic, then it's an a priori investigation into the identity of these capacities, insofar as they are relevant for cognition, for knowledge, for experience in the full sense. And everything else, of course, also what is, brought about by cognition in Kant. Okay, so there are a whole lot of, capacities, faculties, so how to bring some order into that whole lot, you need criteria. And I will talk about these criteria now. Just to give some more background, that Kant also holds the analogy between physical powers and capacities. Here's a really, really nice quote, I think, from the first critique. Yeah, so where he, and I will not read that out because of time reasons, but where he compares our cognitive capacities with the rotation, motion and rotation, where centrifugal and centripetal force interact, and together with the path of motion here give rise to this this way of motion here. So that's his analogy. So, and he wants to say, similar or analogical to the physical forces, the cognitive forces, if they are interfered with, and that's his error theory, if there's an interfering factor, then error arises. So error comes about by interfering factors, and that's why we have to analyze our capacities in order to know which factors give rise to error. And that's this passage is at the beginning of the dialectic. Okay. So here's an analogy, very complex. It's not really necessary, I think, for our topic now. Let's go to the identity criteria for cognitive capacities. So Kant subscribed to the one action, one power criterion that Crusius introduces, and he explicitly applies it in the third critique, where he introduces Urteilskraft as a relatively fundamental power, because he now found the principle of purposiveness. So, and this action, this principle, there you can see that he not only has Crusius one action, one power principle, that he also has a second principle, namely the principle of the one principle, one power principle. So if there is a principle according to which a power acts, an epistemic principle that is epistemically relevant, then we should assume that there is a power according to which that acts according to this principle, right? So if you have a principle, then there is a power that acts according to this principle, an epistemic principle. Now, a condition for these both are that an irreducibility condition. A disposition is a fundamental causal power if its action or principle of action cannot be further reduced to other actions or principles. Right? So, and then given these three principles, we arrive at the epistemically accessible, relatively fundamental cognitive capacities. And that's the task of transcendental philosophy, to single out these capacities and to analyze how they interact, to bring about certain outcome behaviors, and to isolate under which conditions they are erroneous. Now, I come to apperception. There are several quotes in Kant that give rise to the idea that transcendental apperception really is such a cognitive capacity, such a causal power that Kant thinks it is a relatively fundamental causal power of the mind. Here are several quotes. Yeah, so I take this for granted. Now, applying the criteria for identifying cognitive capacities as relatively fundamental causal powers, I take it that Kant is fully justified in thinking that apperception is a relatively fundamental causal power because there is a unique action that this power performs, and this is unification. It gives what it brings about. It brings about the representation of a manifold as one, and that's the same description actually that Leibniz gives of the apperception, and that's why Kant uses this term. So what the apperception does, it takes several representations of different kinds of representations and is able to produce a single representation out of these different sources. And here's a quote that kind of I think nicely puts it in Kant. But in addition to the concept of the manifold and of its synthesis, the concept of combination also carries with it the concept of the unity of the manifold. Combination is the representation of synthetic unity of the manifold. The representation of this unity cannot therefore arise from the combination. By being added to the representation of the manifold, it first makes the concept of combination possible. So this transcendental apperception fulfills the one action, one power criterion. Also, its actions follow specific principles, namely the categories. So here's a very simple model. So this is apperception, this is judgment. There are two causal powers. Their specific action, apperception, specific action is unification, judgment, specific action is subsumption, and they interact and give rise to judgments, different kinds, given certain manifestation conditions. Okay, so they're categorical or hypothetical judgments, depending on the circumstances under which these causal powers operate. Okay. Now, so its action is unification. It follows specific principle, namely the categories. It seems to be a multi-track power that, because there are several categories, so it can act according to several principles, but it invariantly has the very same kind of action, namely unification. So we are justified in believing that there's just one power of apperception. Also, it is a power that operates on any kind of representation. So that's what its specific function is, that it unifies representations of different kinds. So it cooperates also with all the other capacities, and it is necessarily cooperates with all the other capacities of the human mind in order to bring it about that representations can be conscious representations. Okay. So apperception influences the process of the mind. It is an influence. It influences the other acts of the human mind. It contributes to our cognitive outcomes. It makes a cognitive process conscious, and it brings about the representation, I think. So that's what it kind of explicitly or manifestly brings about, or can bring about, the representation of I think. It doesn't have to bring this about, the I think part. That's what Kant says, paragraph 16. But in being active, given certain conditions, it can also bring about this representation, I think. By doing so, it attaches to each and any representation the thought, I think. It brings about the relation of reference between judgment and object, in kind of operating on these different representation. It is the very capacity that kind of makes reference possible. Also, it has to cooperate with sensibility and imagination in order to do so. So reference comes about if apperception kind of, unifies the input that these two other cognitive capacities give. If it does not cooperate with sensibility and imagination, it can produce judgments, but they lack reference or function as principles. So that's where the dialectic comes in and error comes in. Okay. Also, it results in self-consciousness if it operates on complex representations and brings about the thought, I think. I think that P, or I think that Q. So since apperception is a necessary contributor of all acts of cognition, and since its power is unrestrictedly able to operate on all representations of the mind, it is able to bring about the absolute unity of self-consciousness by unifying all representations and makes them mine. Now, this is a very simple model to tell you what I think the very simple model of the human mind Kant has. So here are 4 capacities, basically: sensibility, imagination, the apperception, and judgment. And they all contribute in order to bring about judgments. You can introduce also other cognitive outputs here. And on the other hand, the transcendental object. And in bringing about these 2 references being made possible, that's a different story, but that's actually what apperception contributes to. So it unifies these different representations and brings about these yellow parts. These are the cognitive outputs. Okay, what it produces on top of that is the thought, I think, as a representational content. Okay, so the identity of apperception is that it is directed towards the representation, I think. It doesn't have to manifest that all the time. So, and that's what lies behind the distinction between synthetic unity of apperception and analytic unity of apperception in Kant. And since it can operate also on its own representational product, the I think, I can also think that I think that, and all of that. This brings me to self-consciousness. Okay. Yeah, so that's basically what I think. Here are the acts that are specific of these capacities. So as I said, the imagination, the action is synthesis, the action of sensibility is apprehension, the action of power of judgment is subsumption, and the action, as I said, of the apperception is unification. Okay. Now I come to the very last bit, only a few slides. Kant, according to this picture, thinks that the human mind is an organized system of cognitive powerful capacities. These cognitive capacities are necessary parts of the whole system of the human mind to bring about one product or cognition, knowledge, science. And I think this is a very interesting way of thinking about Kant's view of the human mind as an organized system. Yeah, so I think that he thinks that apperception brings about consciousness, and this is a fundamental fact about this power. So we cannot explain apperception beyond this point. It's just a fact that we are able to do this, and there's no way of explaining it. And that's kind of a benefit of the powers theory, that it's beyond explanation. It's just a fact, something that we can do. How it brings about self-consciousness is left unexplained, and I think that Kant knows that. The account aims at explaining cognition and knowledge to answer the question of how metaphysics, pure science, morality are possible, but it's not designed to explain how consciousness is possible. Kant, I think, believes that this would be part of psychology, and transcendental philosophy is not psychology. And this is why logics may be the guide to the metaphysics of the mind, if it is to explain cognition and knowledge. And this is why also powerful capacitism can be a model here. Okay, so to conclude, the theoretical virtues of this account is that it is very simple, it allows for simple models, it stops the regress of explanation at the right point, no explanation of how consciousness or self-consciousness is possible, and it has explanatory power. It gives a dynamical explanation of the human mind. It aligns mind and nature and makes it kind of more easily accessible in ways. It fits with the phenomena, I think. And here are my very short results. Kant applies the pluralistic multi-track influence models of powers to the human mind. The identity of capacities is fixed by three principles: the one action, one power principle, and the one principle, one power principle, and the irreducibility principle. The human mind is an organized, complex system of powers, and apperception is a powerful capacity. And there's still need for a deep analysis of this aspect of Kant's transcendental philosophy, of course, but we leave it to this. Thank you.